The baby was already crying when the nurse tried to take him. Not because he was hurt, but because two women were holding on to him at the same time. One whispering, "He's mine, I carried him." The other shaking, barely able to breathe, saying, "No, I waited my whole life for him." And somewhere in between their trembling hands, a child who didn't understand why love suddenly felt like war. But 9 months earlier, they were sisters who would have done anything for each other. And neither of them knew this was how it would end. Oyin had always been the older one, the responsible one, the careful one, the one who planned her life like a quiet promise she intended to keep. Her house smelled like lavender and clean linen. Her mornings began with silence and tea, and for years there had always been an empty room at the end of the hallway. A room painted soft cream, a crib that had never been used, tiny clothes folded with hope that slowly turned into something heavier. She had lost count of how many times she had sat on the cold edge of a hospital bed while doctors spoke gently about low chances and trying again. She smiled through all of it. But at night, when the house went still, she would press her palm against her stomach as if her body had simply forgotten what it was supposed to do. And the silence would answer her, still, empty. And each time, it hurt a little more than the last. Until one evening when she stopped pretending she was okay. And that was the night she told Simi. Simi had always been the opposite, loud where Oyin was quiet, impulsive where Oyin was careful, the kind of person who laughed too hard, loved too fast, and never thought twice about jumping into something uncertain. But when Oyin spoke that night, Simi didn't laugh. She sat across from her sister, watching the way her fingers trembled around a cup she wasn't drinking from. And for the first time, she saw not just her older sister, but a woman who was breaking. "I don't think it's ever going to happen for me," Oyin said softly. Simi didn't respond immediately because something had already begun forming in her mind. Something reckless, something irreversible. And when she finally spoke, it changed everything. "I'll do it," she said. Oyin blinked. "Do what?" "I'll carry the baby for you." The room fell into a silence so thick it felt like the world had paused to listen. Oyin laughed at first because it sounded impossible, but Simi didn't laugh back. And slowly, impossibly, hope began to creep into a place that had learned to live without it. That night, they held each other and cried, and neither of them realized they had just made a promise that love alone would not be able to keep. The process was clinical. Cold rooms, bright lights, papers that reduced something deeply human into signatures and clauses. Simi signed easily. Oyin hesitated. Not because she didn't want the baby, but because somewhere deep inside, a quiet voice whispered that this kind of arrangement came with a cost no one could measure. Still, she signed, because hope, even fragile hope, was stronger than fear. And just like that, everything was set in motion. The pregnancy started like a shared dream. Oyin attended every appointment sitting upright, listening carefully, asking questions. Simi joked with the nurses, rolled her eyes at the vitamins, and complained dramatically about morning sickness. They laughed together, planned together, imagined a future that felt finally within reach. At night, Oyin would rest her head gently against Simi's stomach, smiling when she felt the first flutter. And Simi would say, "See? He already knows his real mom." And for a while, that was enough. Until it wasn't. The first shift was small. So small. No one noticed it at first. Simi stopped saying "your baby." She started saying "the baby." Then, quietly, "my baby" slipped out once. She laughed it off immediately, but something had already changed. Because this wasn't just a process anymore. This wasn't just a promise. This was a heartbeat inside her. A presence. A life that responded to her voice, her touch, her existence. And no contract, no matter how detailed, had prepared her for that. By the 7th month, Simi had stopped attending the planning meetings. The nursery was ready, the crib assembled, the tiny clothes finally waiting for someone real. But Simi hadn't stepped foot in that room in weeks. And Oyin noticed. Of course she noticed. That evening, they stood in the quiet living room, just outside the hallway that led to the nursery. The door to that room was slightly open, just enough for the soft cream walls and the edge of the crib to be visible from where they were. The house was unusually still, the kind of silence that made every small movement feel louder. Oyin stood with her hands loosely clasped in front of her at first, then slowly tightened her fingers together when Simi refused to look at her. Simi leaned against the arm of the couch, one hand resting on her belly, the other hanging by her side, her body turned slightly away, as if already leaving a conversation that hadn't begun. The space between them felt narrow, but heavy. "You've been distant," Oyin said one evening, her voice carefully controlled. Simi shrugged. "I'm just tired." But her eyes didn't meet Oyin's, and in that moment, something cold settled into Oyin's chest. Fear. The kind that doesn't shout, but lingers. The kind that knows something is wrong before the truth has the courage to show itself. The truth came 3 nights later. It didn't arrive gently. It didn't ask for permission. It broke through. "I don't think I can give him to you." The words sat between them, heavy, irreversible. Oyin stared at her, waiting for the rest of the sentence. The part where Simi would say, "I'm joking," or "I didn't mean that." But it never came. Instead, Simi's voice cracked. "I thought I could. I really did. But he's mine too." "No," Oyin said immediately, too quickly. "No, Simi, that's not how this works." But even as she said it, her voice trembled, because for the first time she realized something terrifying. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a war. The argument became louder, sharper. Words that once would have been unthinkable now flew freely between them. "You signed the contract. I'm not a machine, Oyin. You promised me. I didn't know it would feel like this." And somewhere in the middle of it all, the bond they had spent a lifetime building started to collapse. Joshua tried to hold things together. Oyin's husband, quiet, steady, always the voice of reason. But even he was torn, because he had seen Oyin cry herself to sleep for years. He had held her through every loss, and yet he couldn't ignore the way Simi held her stomach like she was protecting something that belonged to her. "I think we need to talk to a lawyer," he said one night. And just like that, love became legal. The court didn't care about feelings. It cared about signatures, agreements, biology, technicalities. Oyin had the legal claim. The embryo had been created from her and Joshua. On paper, the child was hers. But reality wasn't written on paper. It was written in sleepless nights, in kicks felt under skin, in a bond no contract had accounted for. And as the case dragged on, the family began to fracture. Their mother stopped visiting, friends chose sides, silence replaced laughter, and the baby, still unborn, had already become the center of a storm he didn't create. The lowest point came in the hospital, after the birth, when everything that had been argued in words collapsed into one unbearable moment. 2 women, 1 child, no resolution, only pain. The room still smelled faintly of antiseptic and something warmer, something human. The overhead lights were too bright, washing everything in a pale, unforgiving glow. Machines hummed softly in the background, steady and indifferent. Simi lay back against the hospital bed, her body drained, her chest rising unevenly, strands of hair clinging to her damp face. One hand rested on her now empty stomach, as if her body hadn't caught up yet. Oyin stood a few steps away, still, like if she moved, everything would change. Then the door opened, and the nurse walked in carrying the baby. The cry came first, soft, fragile, new, and then louder, filling every corner of the room. The nurse hesitated just slightly, her eyes moving between the two women, and that was when they both moved at the same time. Simi pushed herself up from the bed, ignoring the pain, reaching forward with trembling arms, her face already breaking before she even touched him. Oyin stepped forward too, slower but certain, her eyes lifting like they had been waiting for this moment her entire life. And suddenly, there were two sets of hands on the same child. "He's mine! I carried him!" Simi cried, her voice raw, unfiltered. Oyin didn't raise hers, she just held on. "No, I waited my whole life for him." The baby cried louder, confused, caught between them. The nurse said something, but it didn't land, because in that moment, there was no contract, no agreement, no right answer. Only two women holding on to the same child. And the exact second they both realized, neither of them was going to let go. Weeks later, the decision came. The court ruled in favor of Oyin. The baby would go to her. Legally, final, unchangeable. Oyin didn't move at first when the words were spoken, but her fingers slowly tightened against her palm, her face holding steady, even as something deep inside her shifted. Simi sat 2 rows behind the front bench, her body folding inward, her hands gripping the edge of her seat before slowly slipping into her lap. And when the nurse finally placed the child in Oyin's arms, she didn't feel victory. She felt something far more complicated. Relief, yes, but also grief. Because across the room, Simi was breaking in a way that looked painfully familiar. The same hollow look, the same empty hands, the same silence Oyin had lived with for years. Only now, it had been given to someone else. Simi didn't fight after that, not because she agreed, but because she had nothing left. And sometimes, losing isn't loud. Sometimes, it's quiet. Weeks passed. The house that once felt empty was now filled with soft cries, tiny movements, and a life that finally existed beyond hope. Oyin held her son close one evening, rocking gently as sunlight filtered through the curtains. She had everything she had ever wanted. And yet, when she looked at him, she wondered something she never expected. At what cost? Because somewhere out there was the woman who carried him, loved him, lost him, and would spend the rest of her life wondering if love alone should have been enough to keep him. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Drop a comment below. Whose side were you on? Oyin's or Simi's? And if you are new here, subscribe. We tell stories like this every week because some stories deserve to be heard. And maybe that was the truth no one wanted to admit, that sometimes there are no villains, no right answers, only love forced to choose who it hurts. Because in the end, the question was never just who the baby belonged to. It was this: can a contract define who a mother is, or does love decide that, even when it breaks everything else?